Let's look at the text, and Minister Joe and I will discuss our way through. So this is Genesis 13, verse 1. So Abram went up from Egypt. So he's come out of Egypt. Remember, we talked about the Abimelech thing, but that's much later in his story. We're back now to him just coming out of Egypt after the whole event with Pharaoh. He and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the Negev. And I mentioned this before, Minister Joe and our listeners, that bees and the letter B in Hebrew, the bait, can be pronounced as a V or as a B, depending on its location in the word. So they've transliterated it as a B because that's the letter. It's the letter bait, but it's pronounced in this context like a V. So the right way to say it is Negev, with a kind of a V-ish sound. But it is a B. That's why it's written that way. Now, Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver and in gold. He journeyed on by stages from the Negev as far as Bethel. Bethel is not called Bethel at this time because Jacob names it that. But the place name has been updated so that we later readers know where he is, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at first, and there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Now Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. This makes sense because Lot's father, Haran, had died. So Lot has the inheritance of his father, and Abram has his own inheritance. And so they're traveling together, but they do have separate possessions. That's important. Now Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. So that the land could not support both of them living together, for their possessions were so great that they could not live together. And there was strife between the herders of Abram's livestock and the herders of Lot's livestock. At that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites lived in the land. Then Abram said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herders and my herders, for we are kindred. Is not the whole land before you?" Let's scroll this up. "Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I'll go to the right. Or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left." Lot looked about him and saw that the plain of the Jordan was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the plain of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the plain and moved his tent as far as Sodom. We'll stop there. That'll give us enough to get started, right?
Oh, yeah.
So we should probably begin by talking about the conflict between Abram and Lot. But I don't want to dictate the conversation. Minister Joe, I usually give you the first word as we enter these texts, because I know that there's stuff stirring in you as you think are good avenues into it. So I'll let you do that. And if you don't have anything, well, you know me, I can always hack at the tall weeds. I'll do that if I need to.
Yeah, it's definitely obvious that it's not necessarily Abram or Abraham and Lot that have the tension at this point. It's really those who work for him, and the struggle that they had to provide water and grazing area, and the sense of competition between who's providing the best, who's doing the best. We see this constantly, not constantly, but a lot within the church ministries where people, they have to have the best, and then sometimes there's ministries that get less because the other ones want more and want better, and so you see a tension there, and I can see when you have something that's living, that's maybe a little bit different than trying to do a ministry. But when you have animals or things that you know that are really dependent on what you have to offer them, then that can be a struggle. I know that from raising chickens. When we had chickens in New Hampshire, some were definitely more dominant than others, and had to be cared for differently. So. And then other animals too, that horses and such, they all have personalities, and then you have people, of course, that have stronger personalities, who are more vocal And so the tension seems to be between, it makes it very clear that neither one of them are suffering as far as financial goes. So financially, back then, it wasn't so much how much cash you had in your pocket. It was more along the lines of how much land you controlled or was able to graze on or use, and then also the actual amount of animals and the quality of them animals.
Yeah, so you've thrown a lot of balls in the air there, and I think it's all going to be interesting to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Historically, this is not an unusual conflict to have, and that's what you were saying. This land, it's not a desert. Israel's not a desert in these days. It's forested, in fact, and there are grasslands and all that, but it's not a robust land the way Egypt was, always being watered by the Nile River, or as Lot notices, the Jordan River Valley, because it has access to water at all times.
Mm-hmm.
This part where they live is very dependent on seasonal rains and getting the right amount of rain, not too much, not too little, and just, it needs to be Goldilocks situation in order for things to work as they should.
Mm-hmm.
And so the land can only support so much. And this is true. It was even true in the United States. The cattle drives and whatnot, where you had to keep moving the cattle. Like the ability to so fertilize and so water one area of grassland that you could keep a herd of animals alive, staying in that location permanently. That's a relatively new experience for most people who work in animal husbandry. It might feel old to us because it's hundreds of years old, but in the ancient world, you had to keep moving. You remember the story of Joseph that comes later. He goes out to find his brothers, and he thought they were in one town, but they weren't to be found, and they end up way further away. They keep moving where the grasses are green. So God has so blessed. Who would have thought God's blessing was a curse? But God has so blessed both of these men, as he said he would, that the land can no longer sustain them together. So the decision here is we really need to part company because our animals are eating too much of the grass. We're moving all the time, which you can see that they are. I mean, from the Negev to Bethel Ai is a long distance. So they are, because of the size of their flocks, they are becoming more nomadic. And so Abraham is suggesting if we part company, we both might get a little more peace. We might be able to settle a little longer in the same area. So Lot likes that idea. And applying that to ministries and to industries, that's perfectly legitimate. I mean, that's essentially what this is. It's an ancient form of industry. It's Pepsi and Coke. It's this brand of religion and that brand of religion. It's anytime everybody's trying to feed on the same resources, there's only a limited amount of that resource. And so there's going to be competition. That's what happens here. You point out, though, and I want to dig into this, the competition is not overtly between Abraham or Abram at this point and Lot, but between their servants who are taking care of these flocks. Now that makes sense. Wouldn't you say?
Oh, yeah.
Because they're the ones doing the work.
Right. They got to report to the boss.
Yeah. And I don't know what the dispute was, but I would imagine it's just over who's getting the better feeding ground.
Yeah, might have been water. The water is so important.
Do you think the world today is aware of the limited resources? It seems to me that success makes people aware of how limited the resources are. Like we live in a culture right now where you have to grow. You grow or you die, right? Plateauing is dying.
Mm-hmm.
So we always have this idea, this is in the church, you should always be adding members. It's in society though, before it was in the church, right? I mean, if you're not growing your market share, then you're dying. If there's pressure on companies to prove that they are growing. So that usually exposes the limited resources that are available. And that's what's happened here. God has so blessed us, we can't possibly live together anymore.
Right.
So they decide that they're going to split. And Abraham does a gracious thing. You choose. Now, the text has already said Abraham is wealthier than Lot, right? At least we assume, because it's mentioned his silver and gold. it says in verse 2, Abram was very rich in livestock and silver and gold. Now we get the implication that Lot also is doing well, but maybe not as well as Abram. So Abram allows the weaker partner to choose where he wants to make his future. That's not a usual thing, I would say. Right?
Right. Yeah. Usually the person who has the advantage is usually the one that has the most influence or opportunity to bring the reality.
And in this time, for someone who is grazing animals, the Jordan River Valley is the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
It's watered all year round. There's grass. Now, people living there today might find that funny.
Yeah.
But it's a different day for Abraham. That's a very different region. And it maybe even for the readers of Genesis would have laughed about it, but it was before God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Apparently that destruction changed the whole ecology of the region. But at this time, it was like the Garden of Eden. And so Lot chooses it. So we'll get into the whole ministry thing and business thing. I think that's going to be important, but let's deal with the historical situation first before we jump to our application. So talk to me about the decision Lot makes and why he makes it.
Yeah, well, I mean, Abraham gives Lot the opportunity to decide. Says you go to the left, I'll go to the right. Like we just mentioned, it's pretty gracious what he does. Doesn't have to do that. He seems to have a lot more power and influence.
And who was called to come to this land and is told that he's going to own the whole thing?
Yeah,
Abram, not Lot. So Abram is clearly in a position of power among the two, and he's the son of Terah. Lot is just the nephew, of Abram. So, he's clearly in the position of power. But I guess Abram hasn't done great so far. But this is really something, right? It's really something to give Lot this choice.
Right. Yeah, risky too. Because he chooses the best things, or the things that are going to produce better for him. Could make it harder on Abraham to find actual places or limits his options at least. I always found it amazing that you see a McDonald's on one side of the street a lot of times and a Burger King on the other side of the street.
Yeah.
And you wonder how either one of them could survive.
Yeah, I remember I worked with a minister who wanted me to plant a church in a very particular location, asked me if I'd be willing to do it. And I looked at that location, there were tons of churches. It didn't look to me, it looked like it was over church. Like there were more churches than there were really people.
Yeah.
And so I said, well, why that location? And he said, well, they don't have a Nazarene church.
Yeah.
All right. So it's a branding thing, not a gospel thing. It's a branding thing.
Right. Or whether there's enough people there to even make up a church.
Right. Yeah. So I wonder, it's the text makes it pretty straightforward why Lot chose where he chose to go. I mean, it looked easier, it looked robust. But you and I were talking beforehand that I suspect there also may have been some other things in Lot's heart. Like Abram has this covenant with God, a covenant never made with Lot. And Abraham is being particularly productive. I mean, he's not just animals, but silver and gold. So Lot may have thought, Abraham's being taken care of. He's better suited to survive in a region that's maybe, and the hill country's not bad. I mean, at this time, it's still pretty nice. The Shephelah, which is the how to translate that? It's like the hill country of the hill country. It's like the sloping plains, mostly grasslands. That's not bad. As long as the rains come in time, it's not bad. So it's not like he's giving Abraham junk. But he may be thinking, I'll find it easier to live in the Jordan Valley, and I don't have the kind of protections Abraham has. So maybe it's better for Abraham. Lot may not have been entirely selfish. He may not just be a young guy going, ooh, green fields, I'll go there. You can have the desert. He may actually think that he needs the low-hanging fruit, where Abraham doesn't need it. Yeah. So It's possible. It's interesting, and I mentioned this at the beginning, that this is a thought process many people go through. They tend to think the weaker you are, the more you need low-hanging fruit, the more you need the amenities. And Lot definitely believes that. He believes as the weaker partner, he needs the better land. And Abraham is genuinely unconcerned where he goes. Now, Lot's decision makes sense, but turns out terribly. And what we're going to have to eventually discuss is what we're meant to learn from this example.
Right.
But on the front side, before we know what happens, Lot's decision makes reasonable sense for a bunch of different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
If he's got the smaller flocks and herds, he may think he needs greater access to resources than Abraham does. He's probably watched God take care of Abraham all the way through. I mean, he certainly saw the stuff in Egypt. He saw the stuff with later, the stuff with Abimelech. It seems like Abraham always kind of makes out pretty well.
Yeah.
So that might be part of his logic. And it might be the logic of a great number of people who selfishly take what they want because they think they need it more than other people.
Mm-hmm.
That could be here as well. I mean, do you have other thoughts about the motivations of Lot?
Yeah, I think he saw an opportunity. Maybe again, it would bring about a better peace between the workers. And sometimes we do things or people do things to make it easier so that relationships are less strained. I think all those probably paid into the equation, but I don't think he spent a lot of time saying yes.
Yeah.
It just happened. Boom.
Yeah, and he gets to settle. We find out later that Lot finally gets to settle. He is no longer a Bedouin. He no longer travels. A nomad, I should say. Bedouin is an actual people group in the Middle East, but he's no longer nomadic because the plain is settled, and you can settle a plain. Just like today, you can keep your flocks and herds on one piece of property if you can fertilize it and water it, and it's going to be productive all year round, which the Jordan River Valley was. Lot will settle. He will actually live in one of the major cosmopolitan areas. He's going to live in Sodom. So Lot will settle. Abraham, because of the region, he continues to be nomadic. He has to be. That part of this country, he has to keep traveling. So, I don't know if that was appealing to Lot, but there are lots of appealing things about the Jordan River Valley at this time, and not as much appealing about the life Abraham is living. Lot chooses the better part for himself. I'm trying to be defensive of him, give him the benefit of the doubt, but I might be being too generous. Maybe you're right. Maybe he just saw an opportunity and he took what looked to be the better part.
Yeah, and I think also too, I mean, if you have a choice between two options, you're more likely you're going to try, you probably pick the better anyways. I mean, if somebody says
based on some criteria, how do you evaluate what's better?
Yeah, I mean, within reason, what I'm saying. You look at a car and it's a really nice car, but it doesn't have air conditioning. And you look at another one, it's like, well, it's not as nice, but it has air conditioning. You might say,
if you're in Arizona, it's an easy decision.
Yeah, or Florida, or
Yeah. If you're up here, people might say, well, can I spend 2 months with the windows down?
Right. Yeah.
With a nicer car. If you live in California, you might think, who's wasting money on air conditioning?
Yeah.
Depends on where you are. But if you are a shepherd,
mm-hmm.
you're going to be looking for green grasslands.
Right.
So Lot makes a reasonable decision. And we are reminded that this strife between, this is verse 7, the strife between Lot's herdsmen and Abraham's herders is exacerbated by the fact that they are living in somebody else's land. The Canaanites and the Perizzites are the dominant powers there in the hill country. So this dispute is probably not going well with the locals.
Mm-hmm.
So there's probably a lot of reasons they need to divide. I still think Abram takes the better part of valor, and maybe exercising his faith in the covenant God made with him, that he doesn't need to fight for the best for himself. He's going to let Lot decide. And when Lot decides to take the better area, at least on the surface. Abram doesn't dispute it. He lets them go, right? And again, verse 13, where I didn't read it, says, now the people of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. That's a little hint that Lot has made the wrong decision. But this is, yeah, go ahead.
The question is whether or not how much he realized that.
You know, I would imagine he couldn't. Well, unless they visited that region, I doubt he could have really known what he was getting into before he got there. And many of us are allured in the same way, right? We look at the low-hanging fruit. We look at the green lands. We look at the ripe opportunities, and we think that's the place for me.
Yeah.
What do we say? The grass is always greener on the other side.
Yeah.
That's an old. I think that's from Grimm's fairy tales, right?
I'm not sure where.
I think maybe a troll owns the bridge you have to cross. I don't remember how that story goes, but I think that going to the other side costs you a lot more than you think, and that's what ends up happening to Lot, because where the wealth is, the wicked go there too. Mm-hmm. You know, people who are lured by those things, they go there too, and you kind of end up getting the same kind of people living in the same kind of regions. Mm-hmm. And people who want an easier life, a settled life, a life where the access to resources is easy, they all congregate in that area. And that's what happens in Sodom and Gomorrah. These are all very like-minded people. And like-minded people congregate in similar places. So the same kind of stuff that motivated Lot to go to this region motivates all of these people to go to that region. And then they begin to build a culture. And we have to decide what that culture looks like. But what the Genesis is telling us is that the culture was already established there. And Lot was going into a culture that wasn't just run-of-the-mill sinners, but the text says great sinners.
Right. They were good at what they do.
These people, the actual Hebrew word is meod, which means mighty. It means strong. So like in the Torah, when it says you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, right? This is the word for strength. Mm-hmm. So these people are sinning with everything they got.
They got it.
These people they're into it.
Bad boys.
So these are great sinners. And immediately after Lot separates and takes that fertile land, God talks to Abram. Immediately. And he says this. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot, I'll move it to the top. The Lord said to Abram after Lot had separated from him, raise your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward, which would include where Lot went. That was eastward. For all the land that you see, I'll give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Rise up, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. How do there's a lot of angles, and if you want to ask me questions, you feel free to do so. I know I'm the host. I feel like I'm the host of this thing.
Yes, yeah.
So I'm curious your thoughts of why God reiterates this covenant immediately afterwards. Is this to encourage Abraham or Abram? Is it to validate the decision he gave to Lot? Is it to emphasize that Lot made a bad choice? I mean, how do you understand God's immediate, because God hasn't spoken to Abraham since he left Haran, at least not overtly in the text. This is God's first discussion.
It definitely sounds like a re-up in a sense of the promise of the land. It almost feels like, Lot is out of the picture totally now with that message, because it doesn't say anything about Lot.
Do you think this was preemptive, Minister Joe? Should Abram and Lot have waited to separate until God spoke to him?
Well, it would have been a different environment, right? I mean, if uh, if he was gonna, let's just say, just rewind it, everybody knows has any idea about Sodom that it's destroyed down the road. So just let
Yeah,
the
in
cat
just
out
a
of the
few
bag.
chapters. I mean, what,
Yeah,
19, chapter
let that
19.
we'll let that out of the bag, and everybody
Yeah.
already knows that.
Spoiler. You should say
Yeah,
spoiler alert.
spoiler alert. You're spoiled now. But if they would have waited, see, it almost sounds like man's wisdom. That concept again between man's wisdom and God speaking to us. If they would have just waited, then they would have. It sounds as though that Lot would still have been a part of Abram's family. Like it sounds like when they
Yeah,
separate,
that's what I'm wondering. I just
yeah,
don't know. God didn't tell them to separate. They made a very reasonable decision based on a conflict between their herders. And it makes perfect sense that they would separate, given the situation that they were living in. But God never told them to separate.
right,
And it doesn't go well for Lot that they separate. And then God comes to Abram and basically tells him that he's going to give him the land Lot went to.
mm-hmm.
Like he was going to give him all of it. So I just wonder. I don't know if their decision to separate, as reasonable as it was preemptive. You just never know. You could read this as though God is validating Abraham, like more or less saying to him, I know it looks like Lot got the better portion, but I'm going to take care of you. And maybe that's it. But you could also see Abram and Lot as having made a preemptive decision they should have waited on. Because had they been given this promise together, history would have turned out very differently than it did.
Right, right.
I mean, all of history is affected by this split.
Yeah, it always seems like there's even every just the struggle of humanity. It's always that struggle between is this my own desire or what's controlling me? Because essentially they could have got rid of some of the flocks. If they had too many, they could have just said, okay, we have too many. That's what people do when they have cattle. We got too many. We got to sell some
some of them
off
off.
because the land's not supporting in this area. So we either stay together or we separate. And if you separate, then you make your own decisions. I'll make my own decision.
Yeah.
That's almost like what I feel like they're saying here is that, you know, these people want independence. They don't want to have to deal with your people.
Yeah.
And we get that all the time, don't we? I mean, uh, as our kids grow up, they want to make their own decisions. They want to do their own thing.
And
we
the
want
herders
that
of
for them
Lot
too.
might have felt that they would have an easier time controlling Lot than they did Abraham.
Yeah.
Because they're living under his thumb. Yeah, people, you can see even church splits or business splits are often motivated by the workers, by the volunteers, by the congregants who kind of start whispering words into one of the other staff members. We would have a better time, if you were in charge. This happens. I've heard these stories all over the place.
Yeah.
So you never know what motivates the split, but I wonder if it was wise to do. I wonder if Abraham made the right decision in splitting Lot, because it does not go well for Lot. Like looking at how things turn out, and it doesn't go well for Abraham either. The next story, which we'll talk about next week, is there's a war, and Lot gets captured. And Abraham has to now spend considerable expense rescuing him. You might have imagined they would have done better if they were together than they end up doing apart. So we're digging deep into this story, right? We want to ask all the questions that occur to us to ask. And one of the, I think, questions that's not often asked is the question, was this a good decision to split? I mean, it was a reasonable decision. We spent the whole beginning talking about that, but was it the right decision? And does God's covenant, did they, this always seems to happen in the Bible. People make a terrible decision like 5 minutes before God shows up. Like this is what happened to King Saul, right? God says, make a sacrifice when I get there, through Samuel.
Right.
And Saul, the people start to disperse, and Saul starts to panic. And he makes his decision just before Samuel arrives, and he ends up losing the throne. Abraham doesn't lose his covenant, but Lot does. Like this decision, Lot pays the price, man. Because
The whole world could have been different if, well, the whole situation would have been different if they didn't separate. That's the thing. And that's I guess the drawing card or drawing thing that we always have to struggle with it is the consequences of things.
Yeah.
You know, how, well, I'll make it personal. How different my life might have been if my parents didn't divorce.
Right.
I don't know. I know it would have been a little bit different. So that to separate, and you've done enough marital counseling as well. You know that there's some marriages that are so badly damaged that you don't know how they can survive if they do stay together. So
Yeah. There's definitely a point of no return in marriage that many Christians are completely unaware of. Like divorce is a piece of paper, but some people have gotten divorced long before they ever signed those papers. And you and I, when we counsel people, you definitely realize that there's nothing to save. This marriage has already died. It can be resurrected from the dead, but that is like starting over. And the only thing they haven't done is signed on the dotted line. Sometimes you run into people like that, and people think that if they stay, as long as they stay together, they're not divorced. But many people stay together and live divorce. So it's true. Maybe the writing was already on the wall with Lot and Abram. Maybe there was nothing to do here but separate because the divisions were already present. We don't know what it would have been like for them to stay together. My only sort of concern that it was a bad decision is because of what Lot has to endure because of it.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, Abraham was in a much better position to make a good decision than Lot was.
Mm-hmm.
Because Lot was younger, less experienced, did not have a covenant with God, and was more vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And that made him vulnerable to making a decision that looked very appealing to him, but turns out to be very poor. Again, I wonder if giving him the choice, as gracious as that was, and as much as it told us about Abraham, I still wonder if it was the right choice. Right. And so there's a lot here. Whenever you dig into these stories, you realize how timeless they really are, because it's not a simple story. It is very complicated, and it's not clear what we should learn from it. Mm-hmm. At least not straightforwardly clear. Mm-hmm. So as we kind of near the end of this hour of talking about it, now let's make some applications. And this is where you were talking about at the beginning. You can make ministry applications, you can make business applications, you make country applications, cultural applications. What do you think we can gain from this story? And we keep saying, everybody knows, maybe people haven't read forward in Genesis. Yeah. Where this ends, after a very circuitous road, which we'll be talking through in the weeks to come, where it ends, and I don't want to you can read these details. Our listeners can read these details themselves, because we want to make sure these videos are appropriate for children. So we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty of what happens, but we're just going to summarize the fact that this ends up in Genesis 19:30 with Lot's wife dead, all of his possessions destroyed with the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and he and his 2 daughters living in a cave where children are produced through wickedness, and 2 nations are born, Moab and Ammon, who become challenges for the people of Israel forever. And yet, out of the line of Moab comes a woman named Ruth, who marries a man named Boaz, who gives birth to a son, who gives birth to a son, who gives birth eventually to David, who is in the line of the Messiah and who becomes part of the fleshly genealogy of Jesus. So God redeems the story of Lot, but Lot's family disproportionately suffers. The decision he makes is catastrophic for his future. And because we know that that's coming, it's really hard to believe he should have left Abram. It's really hard to believe that was the right thing. And we want to keep all that in view when we think about how does this apply. So you started our conversation with an application. Talk to me about the ministry applications that you see drawing out of this.
Yeah, well, oftentimes, I mean, when we talked about with our decisions being driven by those who are the workers or the busy bees, oftentimes it's really tricky to try to discern what people are really saying, what they're really struggling with, trying to overcome personality conflicts and bullying and tensions that people have just because they either don't, simply put, sometimes I don't like that person for some reason. They just don't like them, and you're like, why? You know, what is the real problem? And yet that to understand and be able to interpret those kinds of things. So in other words, to summarize what I'm saying on this first point, it would be often just taking the exit polls or hearing what people say and trying to make a logical human decision seems like inadequate as a result of reading this text, because the workers were the ones that were complaining. It wasn't. Right. It doesn't say it was Lot and Abram or Abraham. It says that the people who were doing the work were complaining.
Yeah.
So it's like a lot of times 80%, 20% do all the work in the church, if those are accurate anymore. And oftentimes it's the squeakiest wheel that we hear all the time. And that may not be the real percentage of the real population. We see that in our culture today with some of these driven things. So what I'm saying in summary is really we need to resist the temptation in ministry to listen to the ones who speak the loudest, and then try to fix that problem with our human humanness or our human wisdom. Not to say that wisdom isn't important or experience isn't important, nor is it to negate people actually having an opinion about things. So they're all balancing all those things.
Yeah, I think what you're pulling out is a brilliant observation, honestly. I think, I'm thinking as you're talking about the things that we don't see them trying to do. We don't see them trying to seek peace between their herders. There's no conversation that's narrated about trying to figure out what the conflict is. They assume that they know. We just have too many flocks. Like, it's just too big a situation. They just kind of jump to that. But there's no peace. They don't seek the Lord, at least not specifically. He doesn't ask God for any advice. Should we separate? Should we not? Those are things that later descendants of Abraham will do. They will seek the Lord. But maybe Abram doesn't know he can do that. Like, at this point, he's called on the name of the Lord at several altars. Maybe he's not heard anything in response. So I don't want to judge him too harshly, but you're pointing out a number of things, including, third and maybe more importantly, you can't let grumbling dictate the direction of your life, right? Just because people are grumbling doesn't mean, it's always easiest to silence the voices by separation. Like, that's always the easiest thing to do. Some people get divorced for that reason. Some kids divorce their parents. They leave and shut it out because it's just easier to create distance than it is to reconcile. But that is a shortcut that rarely works out well in the scripture. And it works out okay for Abraham, but it doesn't work out well for Lot at all. So you're pointing out all of those things. And I would think that as believers who know the rest of the story, if we found people in this situation, I would advise what you are suggesting. Well, let's get to the bottom of this dispute first. Let's see if we can make peace. Let's seek the Lord. And let's remember, just because some of the herders are complaining doesn't mean they're all complaining. Right? I hear you saying all those things.
It just seems though that it's easier to listen to the people that are frustrated, especially if they're doing all the work. You really want you really want to enable people to do the work, but yet if they're complaining, all the time about the person across that they sit next to. All the time. That's all they talk about. And they're consumed by that. It's so painful.
Yeah, and sometimes for leaders, it's just easier to separate those two. It's like what we do with our kids. Like our kids are fighting, we send them to separate rooms.
Mm-hmm.
Probably not the wisest thing to do in the long run, but it certainly gets some peace in the short term. And that's what happens with Abram and Lot. They do get peace from this decision, but it's very short-term peace. I mean, the very next episode, there's more.
Yeah. And then the other thing maybe to look at is that there's going to be decisions that we're going to make. They all have consequences. But I doubt that most of them are going to be as drastic as destroying a whole city. But yet there are some things that we do see that are so destructive that can be the smallest of detail that happen here. I mean, it began with basically we have too much, so that doesn't sound like a big problem. But then you move yourself into another situation and makes it more complex. So actually moving into more or something that looks better all the time isn't always the best.
Yeah, you're digging into something that actually stands out for me too in this text. And I wanted to make sure we emphasized it before we ended. Sometimes choosing where to live based on the amenities or the access to resources or the productivity of employment, those were all the things that draw Lot to that plane. But one thing he does not consider is whether the people are given to wickedness or not. That seems like a very unimportant factor in making a decision where to live. You want to live where there's a job, where the grass is green, where there are amenities, where there are things to do. That's why people move, and that's why Lot went here. But the people of Sodom were wicked. Did he even consider that? Most people don't. I rarely hear somebody tell me that they moved to a city for anything other than work or schooling. Like, that's why most people move, and that's why Lot went here. How many people move to a place specifically because of the content of the character of the people? Very few people even figure that in, and I think this is a cautionary tale. No matter how blessed you think a people are, their wickedness will catch up with them.
Yep. Sins will surely find you out.
I've often said this. I've said it to my wife. If I were not a minister, if at some point I retire from this particular calling, the Lord releases me from it, and I get a job that's not ministry related, I will most likely choose to live based on a church. I will most likely choose a city based on a church. I already have 2 pastors in 2 churches that are very appealing to me. And I would be more apt to move for that ministry than I would for a job. But that's because living in the church the way that I do, I know how terrible it is to try and make your way in the world without good Christian shepherding.
Yeah. Well, even that concept is a challenge these days because of so much transition. You know, and
right, because people aren't stable.
Yeah, it would have to be totally predicated. For me, any move that we make or I make, or whatever, and I'm not just trying to one up you. So
Yeah.
Don't take this that way. It would definitely have to be God leading me because, and I think you're saying that too. I
am, and under the idea that the right kind of enculturation lasts into the future, whether a particular individual remains there or not.
Right.
You know, that there's a certain ethic, cultural ethic. And I know I haven't had to make those decisions. I move all over the place by calling. Mm-hmm. But there are certainly a few places where it looks like there has been healthy, sustained growth in Christ over time.
Yeah, and that's vital.
Yeah.
That's vital. And a precious thing. I mean,
and rare.
There you have to, you'd have to dig in a little bit in order to know that, because you don't always know that, because it looks good, it looks fertile, looks like things are going well, and you get there and you build an altar, and then
You're
what's
going to
going
make
on?
mistakes. Yeah. And my point isn't that we always get it right, but
Yeah,
how many of us make that our consideration? Most of us are going to move or choose to live and settle in a place based on, like I said, work, education, amenities, family.
right.
That's what we're following. Lot he can't make the family decision because they're in a new land, but he hits all the other points. It's fertile, his flocks can feed, there's lots of opportunity, there's lots of amenities. This looks like a real fertile area.
Yeah,
But the text tells us it's also a profoundly wicked area. But
right.
that doesn't figure into his calculations. What I'm saying is it should. For those of
Yeah,
us who want to follow Jesus, the moral climate of the place that we go should be considered also. And had Lot made that calculation, he would have made a different choice.
yeah. And I think some people quote that quote. It says, I'd rather live on the doorstep of hell, trying to save the person, so they know exactly what they're doing. That's so different than saying I want to live
That's
on.
different. Being called to
Yeah,
tax collectors and sinners is different than just choosing to live there because they're wealthy and there's a lot of wealth and I might catch some of it.
right.
Those are two very different motivations.
Yeah, that's I think so vitally important to talk about or bring out is that Lot never even put that into the equation. So that X in that equation, what does X equal, kind of thing, was never even put in there. So you're gonna have a different type of variable.
Yeah, and of course, at this point, did they even know what real righteousness is, or did they even have the tools to evaluate how wicked Sodom was? The answer is probably not, but they didn't wait for the Lord either. But you make a good point, and it's important. There's a difference between Lot and Jonah, right? Both of them go to cosmopolitan cities that are prosperous and amenity-filled in their day, right? Jonah goes to Nineveh, Lot goes to Sodom. But my point is that Jonah goes to Nineveh because God has sent him on a mission. He doesn't even want to go to Nineveh.
Mm-hmm.
Lot goes for all the wrong reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's like a gold rush. Why did people move to San Francisco in the old days? For the gold rush, right? They were the 49ers. They were going for the money. Well, that's not always the best reason to go. And that's my point. Lot gets into a lot of trouble chasing the green grasslands. And many of us will too. Not because you shouldn't be chasing green grasslands, but what God considers green is very different than what the world considers green. Sodom was green from a worldly perspective, but it was a barren desert by God's perspective. And that's the calculation we need to be including in our decision making. And that's my point.
Yep.
We will get burned. We'll think we're going in a very godly direction and sometimes find out that we weren't. But what matters is what we're aiming at, not so much always what we hit, which we can't control. We can all be deceived.
And I guess the text doesn't really present it either, where they both could have asked God,
and maybe they did. I hear some of the people I've pastored over the years saying, how do you know they didn't pray? And I don't know, but I stick with the text as it presents itself.
It just doesn't say it.
Seems like a pretty important detail not to include.
Right.
And I can hear some saying, but Abram did call on the Lord. You remember? He made that altar and called on the Lord. Maybe that was his attempt to pray. Maybe it was, but he didn't wait long enough because God doesn't answer till after they split. And my insistence, and I tried to do this at the beginning, is to say, let's sit in the culture, let's sit in the context, let's sit in the language, let's really dissect the story and let the questions we have arise out of that discussion. And now we can start to apply. That's it. Yeah. And I think you've pulled some, not all of that was low-hanging fruit. Some of it were, you needed a ladder to reach, but we got it. And now I hope our people we'll not get caught up just in the last thing we talked about, which is about how we decide where to live. But in the earlier things that you mentioned about maybe making peace, maybe not listening to the herdsmen, and just because people are complaining doesn't mean that we have to split. Maybe it's not everybody. You mentioned these might just be the squeaky wheels. So the whole decision-making process on why we separate is so anemic here. They make a very, you might even say, rash, logical, reasonable, but rash decision. And it turns out poorly for Lot. And we could learn how to approach a decision like this in better, more healthy ways.
Right.
Yeah. Do you have any final words for the folks as we close?
Yeah, I think. I would encourage you to not, because a lot of people get paralyzed with decisions too. They get this, kind of afraid of everything kind of thing, and never do anything. Won't try anything. I think that what we've talked about today is not necessarily that. It's more of the opposite, where we just kind of just like, well, this is a logical decision. This is the next step. A lot of times people will think, well, I'll go to high school, finish high school, go right off to college, and then college and PhD, and then PhD. These are all these normative type of things, or get married in between and have kids or go to seminary. And these are all logical benchmarks that we put into our lives without the realization that if we're not going to slow down long enough to listen, or even ask God those important questions, and give the space for an answer, we might be missing the whole gist of why we're here. Yeah. And I know that sounds desperate, but I just have talked to people in the past about this, kind of just say this at the end. They just look at me. They're in college and say, I'm not sure what to do with my life. I don't know. I just want to know what God's will is. And I just look at them. Do you really think it's that hard to know God's will? I think it's as basic as asking Him and being thankful in all things. These are all parts of things. It's for you, God's will for you in Christ, to be thankful, to pray in all circumstances, to pray continually, and to give thanks. I said, is God's will that difficult that we spend all of our life trying to figure out what that is?
Yeah. Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, share with those who have need. Don't strive to not hate your brother. Don't treat other people as means to end by lusting after them, but treat them as ends in themselves. Like He gives us so much in His will, but we often want something a little bit more specific. Like we don't like those general things. But yeah, you're right. The book we're reading, Hearing God by Dallas Willard, one of the things that Willard argues, and I think that this is wise, I think he's right about this, is that God will not always tell us where to drive. Mm-hmm. Sometimes He'll let us choose. And that's an important part of maturing. So and that seems to be what He did here. He seems to have allowed Abram and Lot to make a choice. But once that happens, we have to evaluate how we made that choice, how it turns out, and what we should do differently in the future. And that's what we're doing with them. I think in hindsight, neither of them would have made this choice. But at the time, it seemed reasonable. And sometimes God lets that happen. You can't be afraid to make a decision because you don't have all the information. But one thing we can learn from their story is there was a critical piece of information that they did not consider. And that was which land was holier. They did not make that decision. It did not figure in, and it should have. But I'm not saying that God's disappointed. He seems to have held off His response until they chose. So God may have been giving them the wheel. So I agree with you. We shouldn't be paralyzed, believing that we need all the information before we can make a good decision, and we have to know God's will before we can choose something. Sometimes you'll be forced to make a decision without all that information. Sometimes God puts us in that position deliberately to see the choice that we'll make, because it's important that we sometimes make choices on our own.
Yep.
That tells us who we are. Everyone who's a parent knows. That's how you raise your children. At some point, you've got to give them the wheel, and God will do that with us. But afterwards, just like a good parent, we need to debrief about the outcome of those choices and whether they were wise.
Right.
And I think in hindsight, this turns out to be an unwise choice, but I'm not blaming them. It seemed reasonable, but they were missing a critical piece. A critical piece. And maybe they were listening too much to the conflict of the herders. That's what you pulled out. I think that's a really interesting.
Yeah.
I think if I taught this, I would spend a lot of time on that.
Yeah. Yeah. The noise is always there. I mean, I used to listen to music all the time when I was a kid, all the time. And I used to tolerate the fan over the stove a lot more. But now it's just noise.
Yeah.
And so I know what it's like when you hear the old person say, "Can you turn that down a little? I can't even think straight." You know, the noise. And
Yeah, I don't know what it is, but I agree with you. When I was younger, I tolerated the chaos much better than I do as an older person. I don't know if that's maturity or it's just I'm losing the ability to concentrate on more than one thing at a time. I don't know.
the skin's probably getting thinner. I noticed my uncle who's 80 years old, or older people. I noticed they talk about how thin their skin gets.
Yeah.
So how easy it is to get a cut, and they hardly even know it. I think the older we get, our tolerance is reduced.
Yeah, we get both more sensitive and less sensitive. It's interesting. Maturity has an interesting result. And of course, human maturity also results eventually in decline, which I'm looking forward to the new heavens and the new earth where those two things won't be so united.
Yes.
But yeah, so thank you for this conversation, Minister Joe. I really enjoyed this. I feel like I learned quite a lot from this passage. I hope it's helpful to our people as well.